Dimitri! Another one of Rod's students studying RF.
So imagine you are one of Rod's astronauts. Thank you, Phil. I'll hold that if that's all right. So you're one of Rod's astronauts. You just arrived on the moon. You build your little dome, as you can see that, just a little bit of artistic kind of freedom. And after a hard day's work, you decide to put your feet up, crack open a cold one. Yeah, okay, beer doesn't work that well in vacuum. And then without thinking, you just put your hand in your spacesuit pocket. You get your phone out. I think it works like that. Snap a selfie. Oh no, how are you going to send it back to Earth so that all your friends can see it and kind of show off a little bit? So that's what I want to talk about. And that reminds me, I'm just a student. I'm a really keen radio amateur. Do we have any NASA comms engineers here? No? Okay, I'm an expert in this field. So I see you all thinking, but what's the big deal? We've done this before, right? 50 years ago. I mean, everyone alive on Earth back then would have watched the video on TV, and yeah, I mean, clearly that worked, right? Of course, what is different between then and now? I guess what's different is the requirements. I mean, back then we were really happy with this really crappy quality, black and white, low resolution video. Today we probably need a bit more. We need high-speed internet connection. We need real-time stuff, right? So, because I don't know any better, I'm not a NASA engineer, I thought I'd start at the beginning. And when we talk about radio communications, usually we have a transmitter, has a little antenna. A distance away, there is another little antenna connected to a receiver. That's about basically a basic radio system. And they are about a certain distance apart. And the first thing we know, and I have to say that with intuition, we can appreciate lots of that complex stuff that happens in science. And the intuition we have with this is that when we're in a car and we're driving away while listening to our favorite radio station, I mean, as we get away from the city, it gets a bit scratchy and eventually we'll lose it. So straight away, we have this feeling that the further away you go, the more difficult it will be to have communications. And that's exactly what this formula tells us, which is the free space path loss formula. Phil? Ooh. Thank you. So it tells us that the loss is going to increase as we increase the distance. Of course, it's also a function of the frequency. Let's ignore that part for now. That's a constant. And here we have another two parameters which have that minus in front of them. That's actually a good thing, because that means they reduce the loss. And of course, these two numbers, they are the gains of the antennas. And what do I mean by gain? Again, intuition. We think that surely a bigger antenna will work a lot better than a smaller antenna. That antenna here, in my world, is called a rubber ducky antenna. That's why the rubber ducky is there. That's not a very good antenna. Then you have a much bigger antenna, which is a Yagi antenna, or maybe a TV antenna or something like that. And maybe you have like the Parkes antenna, which is a 64-meter dish, like a really large antenna. So clearly that antenna is going to work a lot better. But again, you might say that I don't really have a feeling of how that's going to affect things. So I thought I put a few numbers on the table. And I start with the moon. So the first thing we need to know is how far away is the moon, right? And as it turns out, it's about 400,000 kilometers, or maybe when it's closer to 350,000 kilometers. So I did this calculation for 1 gigahertz. I just arbitrarily picked a frequency, which is not completely unreasonable. And the difference of 50,000 kilometers, which you would think is going to be a large difference, in reality ends up giving you only a difference of 1 dB. No, 1 dB. You have to take my word for that 1 dB is almost imperceptible. I mean, you won't even realize that the signal has fluctuated by 1 dB. So no big deal. You can thank the logarithm for that in the formula. But if we look at the Mars situation, then we are a lot further away. Now we are 50 to 400 million kilometers. And suddenly the number jumps to 270, like 45 dB higher, up to 60 dB higher, because Mars, of course, can be much further away from the Earth. And of course, that's called a CZG, by the way. It's a nice word to remember if you like playing Scrabble. It's where the Mars is on the other side of the sun. Suddenly we have a lot more loss, free path loss. And, but again, you might say 50 dB, I don't have a feeling of that. So what I did is I thought I have a little worked example just to give you a bit of a feeling of the size of antennas, equipment, and so on that's required. So that requires a little bit of explanation here. So I thought I put Mars on this end and I put the Earth on that end. So we start with our astronaut. Google failed me. I looked for a good photo of an astronaut on Mars. I couldn't find one. That's the closest I could get. So let's just assume this is an astronaut on Mars. And he has a little 100-watt amplifier. Well, that's his transmitter power, let's say. And I mean, we all have a feeling about what a watt of power is, like boiling the kettle, maybe 1,000 watts, a microwave oven, about 1,000 watts, solar panels on the roof, maybe 3-4 kilowatts. So 100 watts is not a lot. You can actually hold that in your hands. It's not very heavy. So I said, let's just put a couple of antennas on it. So I just pick those antennas off eBay because we are trying to do it on the cheap here, right? So $100 each, not particularly large, about that big. They're used for Wi-Fi. You have that large path loss, fine. And on the Earth, I said, a bit of nostalgia. Maybe we can use the Parkes antenna. Only this time we're picking up the signals. Phil is going to have a heart attack. All right. I picked the Parkes antenna, and after we put these numbers on the equation, that results with a receiver power of -117. And again, I have to say that you have to take my word for that. That's enough to have a signal that's reasonably strong to hear, but not necessarily the strongest signal. But anyway, it's like a voice signal, and would have been quite similar, let's say, to the signals that we heard 50 years ago when they landed on the moon. Anyway, and the result, of course, is lots of happy people in front of the receiver listening to this fella. Now, let's compare that to what happens when we are on the moon. So, again, Google failed me. That's the best astronaut I could find, holding a microphone and vacuum. Jesus. Anyway, so this time I said, let's give this fella only 10 watts of amplifier and only one of these antennas. Okay. But we have a much smaller path loss now. So I decided at the end, instead of having the Parkes antenna, well, let's get something that's a bit more, perhaps not a Bannick's thing, but it's quite common. You see these antennas in the suburbs. They're just standard antennas for watching satellite TV. 1.8 meters diameter. That's the antenna calculated for. And again, we end up with a number which is quite achievable, and everyone is happy listening to that fella. Anyway, but you might say, but what's the big deal? I mean, there's somebody's voice coming from the moon or elsewhere. That's okay. We've seen that before. And again, the big deal is that the requirements today are different. So we would like to have, instead of an analog voice, we would like to have a super duper high speed digital connection. And what's the problem with that? Now, the problem with that is, as with many things in life, is that you can't have it all. And in information theory, there is this Shannon Hartley theorem that tells us that in order to get, let's say, a high speed digital link, we must have very large bandwidth. And basically, this is all about compromise. So we have to have a lot of bandwidth. We have to have high power transmitters. But even if we keep cranking up the power on the transmitters, perhaps we can do that to a degree on Earth. But we can't necessarily do it on Mars or the moon. Still, there are limitations. So, but the key message here is that we need a lot of bandwidth. I mean, not the 3 kilohertz of voice. We need a lot more than that to get high-speed data. And what's the problem with bandwidth? And that's another difference between 50 years ago and now. And that is very nicely summarized by this beautiful color and slightly screwed up mosaic. What's going on here? Anyway, computers. I'm a computer scientist, by the way. I'm not a physicist. So I can say that. Anyway, so what we have here is a radio spectrum. Starts from very low frequencies all the way to almost light. And the different colors that you see here are basically the allocations which happen globally, because otherwise if everyone doesn't play by the rules, this does not work. There will be a lot of interference. So these are the different allocations. For example, this part here is the medium wave transmitters. You might say that seems like a lot of waste for a couple of shock jocks. Anyway, there's a Radio National sometimes is in there. So good. So, but what's the problem? I just want you to see that dark brown color there, which is what is actually allocated for space communications. And I mean, of course, this is slightly screwed up. It's not meant to look like that, but you'll find that there are not many allocations like here's one, here's another one, a tiny little one here, two tiny little ones there. So not a lot of bandwidth is actually available to do something like that. And even the fact that humans or all countries have decided to allocate and separate this and keep it for that particular application, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is happening and there's no illegal broadcasting. So there are lots of challenges associated with that, and because I see Phil is about to jump on me, I'm running out of time. I'll leave it at that. I just prepared before you, despite what Emma just told us, if you still want to volunteer, perhaps you want to read my table here in order to have a better idea of what to expect in terms of internet services, right? And with that, I'll just leave it at that, I think. I'm probably over time.
Dmitrios Tsifakis! Thank you, Dmitri.